I'd like to start with a comment for our seniors at the beginning of their writing period. Much of this lecture is about the pleasures of reading, but while working on it, I found myself thinking about the relationship between pleasure and writing, about how the work of writing can with time become a particular kind of intellectual and creative pleasure, which is an important part of what I agree with Aristotle in calling the greatest human pleasure, the pleasure of thinking. I wish for all of you seniors that you might find in your own work over the next few weeks the kinds of pleasure that writing can be, and that you come to see your essays in the spirit of Montaigne as occasions for the excitement of discovery and the delight of insight. The following lecture consists of an introduction, 3 parts of unequal length, and a short conclusion. It should last about 50 minutes. There are handouts. I think there's still a few in the back if everyone needs one. Missing from the handout is an epigram I neglected to include that starts the lecture, so I will read that by the German philosopher Theodor Adorno, who writes, "Every artwork, if it is to be fully experienced, requires thought, and therefore stands in need of philosophy, which is nothing but the thought that refuses all restrictions." I also want to say before beginning, I read through this afternoon. I've been working on this for quite some time, and I got to the end and I realized, I forgot to say the one single and most important thing about this book in my lecture, which is that it's tremendously funny and great fun to read. I hope that that is not entirely lost in the pedantic nature of what's to follow. Introduction. What do we love when we love to read? Is it the knowledge and truth certain books contain? Or is it a kind of literary, that is to say, aesthetic pleasure we find in the activity of reading? And if so, is there an ethical dimension to this kind of activity and the pleasure we find in it? Imagine you are back in your room later tonight and you open to the first sentence of a favorite book. You read, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep." Or, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." Or, "Supposing truth is a woman, what then?" You read, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Or, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." You read, "Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles." Or, "The world is everything that is the case." For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Midway through life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, Aristote's son, in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to recall. Call me Ishmael. These echoes and reminders of books we love, opening sentences which are invitations to re-enter familiar worlds and rejoin friends and ideas which still promise new and unexpected discoveries, evokes for me this question: what is it we love when we love to read? Is it the book itself, the characters, images, ideas, and possibilities it contains? Is it who we become when reading? Or is it the activity, not the goal, our reasons for reading a particular book, but rather reading as the thing itself, independent of any meaning or truth or understanding of ourselves and the world we hope to achieve by means of reading? That is, when we say we love to read, are we thinking of reading as a means to truth or knowledge or understanding, or as an end in itself, a pleasurable activity we do for its own sake? Or is it, most probably, some relationship between all of these? After all, it is by virtue of reading things that we come to make sense of them, come to understand them, and come to care about them. Reading presumes that something is meaningful and that by virtue of our reading, we will discover that meaning, unless it is by virtue of our reading that sometimes we make things meaningful. I began with a series of opening sentences from favorite books, not only because of the pleasure of repeating these evocative echoes to an appreciative audience, but also because, as different as these works are from one another, as different as Genesis is from Wittgenstein, or Jane Austen from Nietzsche, Plato from James Joyce, and Melville from Dante, these works all have something in common, which is a familiar use of language's referential function to advance and develop narrative and argument, to create characters, tell stories, and explore ideas or defend theses. Indeed, it might be difficult to imagine a use of written language which does not employ referentiality in the service of exposition. And yet such works exist. One such work, and one of the first in the history of Western literature, is Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, a literary work as different from Tolstoy, Nietzsche, and Homer as these great works are both from one another and from how-to manuals and shopping lists. Tolstoy's novel is a complex work that weaves together social, political, historical, and theological questions against a backdrop of richly constructed characters. But when he writes about a ball or a glass of vodka, the reader can confidently imagine his characters dancing and drinking. Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil is a radical philosophical inquiry into axiology, epistemology, morality, and metaphysics. But when he opens the work with a metaphor, that of truth being a woman, the reader comes to gradually understand this metaphor by engaging with what Nietzsche means by truth, and perhaps more difficultly, what he thinks of women. When Homer writes of the gods, it may be difficult to say exactly what these characters mean in his poems, but we know they play a complex array of social, political, theological, psychological, and literary roles, and that these roles can be better understood through careful attention to the language, imagery, and actions with which the poet describes these divine characters. But then we turn to the opening sentences of Tender Buttons. This is on your handout. Here are the first 3 sentences of this book. A kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color, and then arrangement in a system to pointing. All this, and not ordinary, not unordered, in not resembling. The difference is spreading. Here, a kind of literary vertigo takes hold. Where are we? What is the poet saying? How is language functioning? To what meaning are these sentences pointing? The first clause defies our expectation that these sentences might be about a kind of glass, since glass does come in different kinds, but this is a kind in glass. Which meaning of the English word kind is meant here? That of a type, or that akin to being nice? The article a suggests the former, but the following preposition in undoes that expectation. These first 4 words, a kind in glass, undoes a great many of our readerly expectations. One wonders how the preposition in between kind and glass is functioning, and how or why the conjunction and links a kind in glass to a cousin. This is further confused by the absence of a verb that a kind in glass and a cousin might be performing. They, the kind in glass and the cousin, are simply there. But what are they doing there? The next clause of this opening sentence asserts nothing strange after a second conjunction linking it with a spectacle, and then moves to a single hurt color, as if to undermine the assertion that there is nothing strange about the idea, or perhaps it's an image, of hurt color. This is followed by the third conjunction in the sentence, linking all that precedes to an arrangement in a system to pointing. But is to functioning here as another preposition, or is it signaling the infinitive form of the verb to point, transformed here into a gerund? Gerunds themselves being forms of verbs that function as nouns, which will be important to what I have to say below about certain words that pose as nouns but function as verbs. Verb noun, preposition, article, and conjunction. Each of the words in the first sentence of Tender Buttons makes sense, but somehow their arrangement does not. We know that is what a system is. We know what pointing is. But what sense can we make of a system to pointing? Is there a point to such a system? Moving on to the second sentence. At this rate, we should have the whole 70-page work explicated in about 36 hours. That all this is not ordinary seems true enough, but we don't get the verb is. Instead, we have another and, as if all this and not ordinary were simply being placed side by side rather than one of them modifying or performing the other. And again, no verb except the gerund resembling. All this what, we wonder, not resembling what, other than any literary work we've ever read before. For here we are very far from the ordinary indeed. In the second sentence, the preposition in again seems to be occupying unfamiliar grammatical territory. Do we take not unordered in, not resembling to mean all this, whatever this is not unordered insofar as it is not resembling, without knowing what the lack of resemblance refers to? Or is it in as in contained by? And since neither of those interpretations reduces the text to sense, or rather, since neither interpretation nor explanation elevate the words to meaning, as we commonly understand meaning functioning in a text, such as when we refer to a glass of vodka as a symbol of a character's moral weakness, or employ metaphors to explore the nature of truth, or speak of the gods as a complex intersection of external social and internal psychological forces, we might begin to suspect that our conventional understanding of how words mean is being radically challenged in this work we've only read the first two sentences of. Tender Buttons is different from other literary works, and according to Stein, the third sentence, the difference is spreading. Part 1, the ancient quarrel. The difference is spreading, but what difference, and what difference does this spreading make? Is it spreading like a contagion, or like butter over a warm slice of toast? Is Tender Buttons itself the difference that is spreading? If so, how different must our reading become if we are to engage with this work on its terms rather than on those of our accustomed habits of reading? That is, what if we were to submit to the poem, for now I'll refer to it as a poem, what if we were to refer to the poem and let it teach us how to read it, rather than assuming at the outset we already know what reading is and how to do it? If we take this approach, then we are admitting that we stand to learn something new from this text, something other texts might not teach us or show us or do to us. Through its startling grammatical constructions, unexpected prepositions strung between nouns that are surprisingly modified, such as hurt color, and absence of action verbs in favor of gerunds, pointing, resembling, spreading, with that pregnant is creeping in only at the end of these first three sentences, Tender Buttons ignites a slow burning fuse of perplexed but playful questioning. But Tender Buttons doesn't just invite us to question its use of words and images, grammar and syntax. It also doubles back on itself, leading us to ask, what happens when we question not only the meaning of what we're reading, but also begin to question how we read, perhaps even why we read in the first place? At St. John's, we spend a lot of time reading and a lot of time thinking about the opening question. But what is a question? In the spirit of a kind of inverse gerund which changes verbs into nouns, allow me to suggest that a question is a noun that should act like a verb, or rather, a host of verbs. Because when you think about it, there's really no such thing as a question. There's only questioning as a form of actively engaging with the world around us and the worlds within us. Grammatically, words like question, philosophy, art are nouns. But isn't that a kind of ruse? After all, these aren't things. They're activities. A question that doesn't lead to questioning, philosophy that doesn't give rise to philosophizing, art that doesn't inspire aesthetic experience are dead objects. The point is the activities they give rise to, verbs, not nouns. And what kind of activities does Tender Buttons give rise to? By inviting us to think about how grammar, syntax, and vocabulary function in a sentence, not by writing sentences that are about grammar and syntax and vocabulary, but rather by the way the text puts these linguistic phenomena to work, or rather to play, Tender Buttons raises questions about what words are and what they do. It's an investigation into the aboutness of being about. What does it mean for one thing to be about another thing, or for a word to mean something? Reading the text leads us to wonder, which as we know is the fundamental philosophic activity. How do meaning, signification, and representation work in language? And what if a work were to start employing these categories differently? Questions of meaning, signification, and representation are philosophic questions, and questioning and wondering are philosophic activities. The way Tender Buttons is about meaning and representation, without these things being the subject matter of an argument or thesis, and the way Tender Buttons invites its readers to participate in the activities of wondering and questioning, mark it as a work which engages with both philosophic questions and philosophic activities while remaining a work of poetry. Unless the difference between these categories as activities rather than things is starting to fray. Tender Buttons does not present an argument or thesis in response to the question, how do words mean? Instead, the reader engages us as readers in a kind of shared questioning about this question. So although there's no single question mark in the whole of the book, the work is full of questioning and of questions. For example, and I believe these are also on your handout, about questions and questioning, the text says, a question of sudden rises and more time than awfulness is so easy and shady. There is precisely that noise. There is red butter. A loaf of it is managed. Wake a question. Eat an instant. Answer. Cold soup. Cold soup clear and particular and a principle question to put into. Pain soup. Suppose it is question. Suppose it is butter. Real is. Real is only. Only excrete a no, since the time when there is not the question is only seen when there is a shower. Any little thing is water. What's the meaning of all this? We hear a reader of conventional mind and accustomed habit ask in outraged tones, but why the outrage? Have they been offended? Scandalized? Has their intelligence been insulted? Or merely challenged? And their sensibility affronted? Or merely given the opportunity to grow? For while it's probably true that none of these passages gives us a very clear idea of what a question is, they do serve as a kind of initiation into the activity of questioning. To say that such sentences are meaningless is beside the point, because one of the things Tender Buttons is doing, and great artworks always succeed in doing multiple things at once, is investigating the very category of meaning, what it is and how it works, how words mean the things or ideas or feelings they signify, which we might assume we understand, until we're challenged to think more carefully about this process of one thing meaning another thing. Tender Buttons invites us to think about what kind of work the language it deploys is doing, and we quickly notice that it's not the same kind of work we're used to seeing language do in other texts, such as those I quoted from earlier. I suspect many readers who find Tender Buttons frustrating or meaningless or worse, boring, are bringing to it the wrong expectations and falling back on habits of reading which are not relevant to their encounters with this work. They are not learning from the work how it might be read. once one is freed by the work from the kinds of expectations other works raise in their readers, entirely new kinds of reading and enjoyment become possible, and a work that allows us to read in new ways, which is a form of seeing in new ways, which is a form of experiencing in new ways, is a rare work indeed. Part of the difference that is spreading seems to be the difference between a work that is about meaning as the subject of its discourse, for example, a philosophic treatise on meaning, signification, and linguistic referentiality, and a work which is doing surprising things with the category of meaning as we commonly understand it. In the case of Tender Buttons, a poetic or aesthetic work that creates a particular kind of reading experience, which is not limited to what the work is about in terms of its subject matter. After all, there is a danger that as soon as you say an artwork is about something else, that something else becomes more important than the work itself. The danger that the artwork ceases to be the thing itself and becomes merely an arrow pointing to something beyond it, such as a feeling, a meaning, a lesson, or a moral. More on this relationship between means and ends below. In asking what Tender Buttons is about, we're drawn into the irresistible play of hermeneutic activity. The poem shows us that the world is inescapably full of meaning, and then asks, but what does meaning itself mean? How do words mean what they mean, and how does language convey or confuse that meaning? Is language really an adequate mirror in which reality is reflected? Can it accurately say what is? Can being be said, that is, rendered or reduced to language? In Tender Buttons, language ceases to be an innocent medium by which other things, ideas, thoughts, arguments, feelings, descriptions of characters or places, instructions or information, are transparently conveyed and communicated, and insists that language is inevitably a part of the meaning we seek to convey. Tender Buttons tests the hypothesis that sometimes language can be not even self-referentially about itself, but simply be. We don't have to ask what a potato means. When we're hungry, it's simply a potato. Could we come in an aesthetic context to think of words in a similar way? But what would it mean for a word not to mean something else, but instead to just be itself? Is there a meaning to that kind of literary ontology? In Eros the Bittersweet, her book about Sappho's poetry, Anne Carson writes of, quote, an axis of normalcy aligned with the conventions of connotation and denotation. It is precisely these conventions that Tender Buttons helps liberate us from, aligning its readers along new axes of potential meaning. In most of this work, Stein's writing is not metaphorical, allegorical, or symbolic. It does not constitute a puzzle that needs solving or a literary enigma such as Joyce presents us with in Finnegan's Wake, which has to be ingeniously unraveled. One might say that Tender Buttons is to be experienced, not explained. But even experience can be enriched through acts of interpretation. However odd its sentences, Tender Buttons is still writing, a peculiar example of a literary use of the English language. And therefore, it cannot help but be both signifying, that is, denotative, and suggestive, that is, connotative. But what it signifies and what it suggests, in this work, these categories, these poetic activities, become simultaneously personal and mythological, which is the universalization of the personal. So that conventional modes of meaning along the traditional lines of connotation and denotation are undermined, our expectations defied, and our experience as readers both challenged and renewed. Language can never escape its connotative and denotative functions, and therefore can never fully escape its role in the fundamental human drive towards hermeneutic activity, the drive to find meaning in the world and derive values from this meaning. But literary language can, through a sort of explosive revelatory power, refuse to conform to these categories as mere conventions, and instead inquire into what these categories are and how they function, how they help structure our understanding and experience of the world, and by doing so, expand the possibilities of that understanding and experience, which is a form of expanding the world itself. Like any great work of art, Tender Buttons makes the world bigger. New forms of signification and new ways of meaning are open to us, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that we are being open to them. Not unlike the revolution in painting, with which Stein's writing is in close dialogue, Tender Buttons achieves a revolution in seeing by means of literature. In the 20th century, increasingly abstract painting refused the traditional representational role of mimetic art and insisted that a painting did not need to be a painting of something else, but could simply be a painting, the value of which would not be measured by its ability to accurately represent a person, place, object, or event, which, as I'm sure you'll recall, is the basis of Plato's critique of art in Book 10 of the Republic. It's in the context of this critique of mimesis that Socrates refers to what he calls the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. I think Tender Buttons sheds an interesting light on this quarrel because it's simultaneously a deeply philosophic work in terms of its form, that is, what it is, if not its content, what it says, and a deeply poetic work in terms of a particular kind of aesthetic pleasure that emerges from the reader's experience of the relationship between its form and its content. Before expanding on the ways Tender Buttons is simultaneously philosophic and poetic, let me say a few words about this relationship between form and content in literary and philosophic works. Great works of philosophy, no less than great works of art, are concerned with the form in which their arguments are presented. The evidence for this claim is found in the fact that it matters that Plato's great writings are dialogues, that Descartes' writings are informal meditations, that Spinoza employed a Euclidean structure for the ethics, that Nietzsche wrote in numbered aphorisms and Wittgenstein in numbered propositions, and that Kierkegaard presented and explored his ideas in pseudonyms. In philosophy, as in poetry, it's not just what a writer says, the work's content, but also how it's said, the form and style of the work that matter to us as readers and thinkers. Perhaps this is because ideas, like philosophy and poetry themselves, are more accurately described in terms of verbs. That is, things we engage with, question, and explore, and not as nouns or things. An idea should be something we actively do, not something we passively have. While the claim that form and content are intimately connected may be controversial when it comes to philosophy, it is a long-standing truism when it comes to art. And it is precisely this intimacy which prompted Walter Pater to claim, in one of the most provocative aphorisms in the history of aesthetics, that, quote, all art aspires to the condition of music. Because in music we find the closest harmony possible between the form and the content of a work. According to Pater, in music, content is form, and form is content. With that idea in mind, let's return to the ways in which Tender Buttons is simultaneously a philosophic and a poetic work. As I said, there is nothing obviously philosophic about the content of the work. In fact, it's not even clear what the content of the work is. It's a book about which it is notoriously difficult to say what it's about. When I say Tender Buttons is not philosophic in terms of its content, I mean it does not present and develop a thesis by means of rational discourse and argument. It does not present its readers with a logos, but rather with an essay, as in Berkeley's essay es percipi, a kind of being itself. The work is philosophical in the sense of requiring that its readers engage in particular kinds of philosophic activities: questioning, reflecting, interpreting, investigating, meditating. Activities which, even when presented in the form of a work of art, are philosophic in fundamental ways, just as Plato's use of imagery, metaphor, allegory, drama, irony, and myth are poetic, even when presented in a work of philosophy. Few philosophers have had a greater understanding of the power of the imagination than Plato. Imagination understood in terms of the human ability and desire to understand the world in terms of images. Hence his use of such poetic devices as the allegory of the cave, the analogy of the line, the tripartite soul, the myth of and the chariot in the Phaedrus. We might say that Tender Buttons is a poetic work that demands philosophic activity of its readers, and The Republic is a philosophic work that employs poetic devices to stimulate its readers' thinking. Thus, both Tender Buttons and The Republic reveal different ways of reconciling the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. But if Tender Buttons is essentially philosophic because of the activities, the interpretive strategies of inquiry and questioning, and demands of its readers, it's essentially poetic for reasons related to beauty, pleasure, and imagination. These reasons form a kind of Venn diagram between poetry and philosophy centered around the fundamental human impulse toward hermeneutics. That is, the pleasure we find and the need we have, which is both simultaneously intellectual and sensual, to find or make meaning in the world. Part 2, the ethics of pleasure. There is, or should be, something deeply ethical about our relationship to pleasure, because, to put it bluntly, some pleasures are better than others. And engaging with them raises the possibility, though unfortunately there are no guarantees, of their helping us become better people. And by better, I simply mean more thoughtful, more intelligent, more observant, more sensitive to others, more aware of the world around us, less susceptible to bigotry and prejudice, less likely to be controlled by fear and hatred, more independent of ignorance and misunderstanding. Among the higher pleasures, perhaps even among the very highest, I place those which result from certain forms of aesthetic experience, which is not to say that I think of art primarily as a means to the end of becoming a better person, because I don't, but insofar as such unintended consequences of our encounters with artworks are possible, I think they would be the result not of our exposure to these works, but rather as a result of the activities such works demand of us as viewers, listeners, and readers. I will not fully develop here the thesis that some pleasures are better or higher than others. We find a good foundation for such an argument in the Gorgias, when Socrates confronts Callicles with the example of the catamite and asks whether indeed, quote, there is no distinction between good and bad pleasures. If we believe there are such distinctions, then it's hardly controversial to claim that there's such a thing as an ethics of pleasure. The next step would be to present an argument in support of the claim that aesthetic pleasures, those pleasures which result from our thoughtful encounters with great works of art, are among the highest and best pleasures which human beings are capable of experiencing. The argument for such a claim might follow the model of Aristotle's argument about happiness in the Ethics, where he engages his readers in an inquiry into the difference between means and ends. What are those things, Aristotle asks us to consider, which we pursue as means to certain ends, and what are those things we pursue as ends in themselves? From this perspective, the question why we might wish to read a work like Tender Buttons, or for that matter, why we read anything at all, takes on interesting dimensions. I began this lecture with the question, what do we love when we love to read? Do we think of reading as a means to an end, for example, knowledge or wisdom or understanding? Or do we think of reading as an end in itself, a form of aesthetic activity we do for no other reason than the kind of pleasure, which I'm arguing here is a higher pleasure, that the activity of reading provides? Obviously, this is not an either-or question, but even admitting the possibility of the latter reason invokes the importance of the idea that aesthetic pleasures, such as reading tender buttons, are ends in themselves rather than means. The same cannot be said for many human endeavors. There are people who think of religion as a means to the end of salvation, who think of sport as a means to health or fun, entertainment as a means to distraction or diversion, and business as a means to the end of making money, which is itself merely a means to one end or another. Politics is certainly a baser activity than poetry, for politics is always and only a means to the end of achieving a certain kind of society, whereas poetry is an end in itself, and therefore poetic activity is always higher, more noble, and greater than political activity, at least according to Aristotle's argument about means and ends in relation to happiness. And what about philosophy? This is where it gets tricky. I would suggest, and I think we find a version of this argument in the Symposium, that those who think of philosophy as a means to an end, whether that end be wisdom, which we're told philosophy is the love of, or knowledge, or understanding, are selling philosophy short. It may be this, but it's more than this. If we think of philosophy as a verb, a kind of activity, something we do, rather than a noun, something we have or know, then I think philosophy as a way of life, a way of engaging with the world and the other beings in it, is an end in itself, the examined life, as Socrates calls it, and of which philosophic activity is an essential part, is not a goal we reach, but a way of living every moment. The mistake of thinking of philosophy as a means rather than an end typifies Callicles' attack in the Gorgias when he accuses Socrates of failing to grow up and occupy himself with the practical matters of adulthood, as if the study of philosophy, appropriate only to children, had no purpose other than the end of preparing philosophic children to become pragmatic, unphilosophic adults. I think this emphasis on what we do rather than what we are, the Nietzschean inversion of traditional metaphysics to emphasize becoming over being, shows that philosophic activity has more in common with poetic activity, despite the supposed ancient quarrel, than it does with other human activities, such as business or sport or politics, which are all means rather than ends. Part 3. Is there any there, or what's the point of an avant-garde? When Stein finally returned to America after many years of living in Paris, she did so to great fanfare. The lecture tour she gave on the heels of the success of her book, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, was promoted in movie theaters by a newsreel that was shown across the country. In this newsreel, Stein said, quote, "My lectures are to be a simple way to say that if you understand a thing, you enjoy it. And if you enjoy a thing, you understand it. Understanding and enjoying is the same thing." Note Stein's appropriate but ungrammatical use of the singular rather than the plural form of the verb to be, along with the use of her verbs as nouns gerunds. Understanding and enjoying is the same thing. As a reader, applying traditional grammatical, hermeneutic, logical, and analytic categories, I'm not sure what would count as understanding tender buttons, but having read it many times, I have a good sense of what it means to enjoy reading this perplexing but delightful work. And if understanding and enjoyment is the same thing, then perhaps the enjoyment I get from the activity of reading it an aesthetic pleasure born from something I do, rather than an epistemological condition I seek to attain, is the only kind of understanding the work asks of us as readers. At St. John's, we take the idea of reading broadly. Together, we read not only stories, poems, essays, and novels, but also musical scores and mathematical equations, the night sky, even under the tutelage of William Harvey, the human heart. Together, we learn to read paintings and movies, the human face, recipes. We can even learn to read, and by read I mean think about, interpret, discuss, and heighten our enjoyment, which means our understanding, of a plate of food placed in front of us during a meal. Reading may itself be a metaphor for a particular kind of attentiveness we learn to bring to our interactions with the world. To read means to engage with, to question, to pay attention to take seriously, to run the risk of falling in love. But why read a work like Tender Buttons, which seems to adamantly refuse to be about anything, the way other books we read are about things like Napoleon's invasion of Russia, or the dialectic development of the world spirit through history, or the deaths of Patroclus and Hector, or the question, can virtue be taught? Why read a book which seems to successfully not be about anything and resist the conventional linguistic categories of meaning and reference? Having discussed what Tender Buttons is and what it does, or more importantly, what it asks us to do as readers, someone might still reasonably ask, why bother? Sure, it's an interesting literary experiment, but once we get the main idea, is there any there, as Stein herself once quipped about Oakland in her book, Everybody's Autobiography? What's at stake in this work beyond the puzzle and the play of it? True, there's a certain musicality in the language, especially in some of the passages we've not had time to read together this evening. And there are provocative images that stir the imagination, such as an elephant beaten with candy. But why, since we already have works of both music and painting, which fulfill the roles of image making and sound creating with remarkable quality and diversity, should we ask language to do what music and painting seem to do so much better? Why ask language to do what it does not do when other art forms are already doing it? Stein suggests an answer. I think this might also be on your handout. She writes, I like anything a word can do, and words do all they do, and then they can do what they never do. In other words, I think, it's not until you push language to certain limits, which one might say has been the task of poetry and the literary avant-garde for the past 3,000 years, that you begin to discover just what language is capable of. It's widely spoken of the fact that Shakespeare invented 1,700 words to express the ideas and feelings of his characters. And it's precisely in this avant-garde tradition of invention that Stein is working. In response to Wittgenstein's concluding remark in the Tractatus, that about which one cannot speak, one must remain silent, I suspect Stein would have said, or find new ways of saying which could only not be spoken about because we had not yet discovered ways of using language to say them. It is this commitment to invention and discovery that is experimental, the experimental nature, which, along with its ability to implicate its readers in reciprocal activities of invention and discovery, could be the there that's there in Tender Buttons. But are there also other things the poem is about, however unconventionally it goes about being about them? Many years ago, I happened to be living in Oakland when I read Tender Buttons for the first time. I remember staring out the window of my apartment, wondering what she might have meant by her comment, there's no there. If there's no there, I wondered, where is it? What if it were located not in a particular place, but in certain activities, for example, in our acts of reading and writing? This idea got me thinking about writing and reading as activities which can take the place of physical place, as they might have done for Stein during many years of expat living in Paris. And this, in turn, led me to think about another Jewish expat writer, a Marxist philosopher fleeing Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, who moved in the opposite direction as Stein, from Europe to California. During his American exile, Theodor Adorno wrote, "To those who no longer have a homeland, writing itself becomes a home." This idea of writing as home is important to Tender Buttons, which, in addition to being a philosophic and aesthetic text, is also an erotic and domestic one, charting intimate aspects of Stein's life with Alice B. Toklas in veiled references and playful innuendo. The work is separated into 3 sections: objects, food, and rooms, which, when mixed with love, are more or less what a house needs in order to become a home. A home, perhaps, especially for gay lovers living in self-imposed exile from America at the turn of the last century. Such a home is a clearly defined space that marks itself off in comfortable and familiar ways from whatever is not home, setting up boundaries between inside and outside, and staking out certain limits of belonging. The history of art is full of examples of works that collide with the same kinds of boundaries and limits that Tender Buttons is pushing against. As early as the 19th century, the term avant-garde, borrowed from military terminology, was used to describe works that push ahead of these limits to the outskirts of what might be discovered. Movements like Futurism, Dada, Surrealism, Situationism, Fluxus, Oulipo, individual works like John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds, and the black canvases Reinhardt painted for the entire last decade of his life, are all examples of aesthetic attempts to carry us to the edge of certain boundaries, perhaps with the hope of getting a glimpse of what lies beyond. Tender Buttons, written under the influence of Stein's involvement with the paintings and the personalities of Picasso, Matisse, and Juan Gris, is not the only literary work to explore these limits, but it was certainly among the first and the most radical in the 20th century to do so. Susan Sontag, in other instances a perceptive critic of avant-garde art and literature, missed the mark when she dismissed Stein's work, writing in one of her notebooks, quote, "The interesting writer is where there is an adversary, a problem. Why Stein is not finally a good or helpful writer. There is no problem. It's all affirmation. A rose is a rose is a rose." End quote. But a rose is more than affirmation. It is a kind of seeing and a showing how to see. As Stein said in one of the lectures she gave during her American tour, quote, "I think that in that line the rose is red for the first time in English poetry for 100 years. Sontag fails to recognize that Stein is grappling with one of the most difficult problems in literature, habit, and in particular, certain habits of reading and writing born out of 500 years of English poetry. This is the adversary, the problem that Stein is blasting. The help she gives is renewal, that Sontag, famous for calling for an erotics of art in her essay Against Interpretation, failed to see in Stein a precursor of this kind of erotics is ironic, especially given that the very line she cites as an example of her criticism, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, is a long recognized punning homonym for eros is eros is eros is eros. Part of this erotic spirit means that Tender Buttons is art that plays with our expectations and assumptions, plays with words and grammar and syntax and the relationship between thought and language, plays with our desire to understand and make sense of things, with our basic hermeneutic instinct, which is fundamental to who we are. Tender Buttons is playful, but does this mean it's a kind of game or a puzzle, a kind of mystery? Tender Buttons says, quote, "A kind of green, a game is green, and nothing flat. A puzzle, a monster puzzle, a heavy choking, a neglected Tuesday." But if this is a game, what are the rules? The work seems to be making them up as it goes along. If it is a game, perhaps it's a game of hide and seek. Where's the meaning? Can you find it? If it's a puzzle, how do we put the pieces together? And if it's a mystery, I strongly suspect it's one we're not expected to solve. After all, what fun would that be? Can we get to the point of simply allowing a mystery to remain mysterious? So why read Tender Buttons? What is this strange work about? And what does it do and ask us to do as readers? It's a book about eros and home, love and domesticity. It's about words and language and the power that words and language have over how we think about and how we see things. Tender Buttons is a book about power, about the oldest power human beings forged between themselves and nature, the power to name things, which, as a part of our most chthonic primal history, eventually became the power of poetry. This is the power of our ancestors whose passing is recorded on the cave walls at Sulawesi, Altamira, and Lascaux. Adam is given this power by God. Incantory spells, chants, and prayers, the control that naming a thing gives the namer over the named, the power of sound, Yahweh, Om, abracadabra, the power of knowing the names of God and nature. Tender Buttons seeks to recapture poetry's primal power to name the world. It is a spell, a calling into being. Conclusion. Here are some facts about the structure of Tender Buttons. In the original edition, published in 1914 by Claire Marie, the work is 70 pages long and divided into 3 sections. The first, called Objects, consists of 58 distinct passages varying in length from a page to 3 words, each preceded by a title such as a box, a piece of coffee, Mildred's umbrella, a chair, a frightful release, colored hats, and peeled pencil, choke. In what sense these passages are examples or illustrations of objects would be the subject of another lecture. The second section, called Food, consists of 53 distinct passages varying in length from 6 pages to 3 words, each preceded by a title such as roast beef, mutton, custard. 4 of these sections are titled Orange, Oranges, one of them One Orange, and one Oranges In. The final section, called Rooms, is a single untitled passage, 16 pages long, consisting of multiple untitled paragraphs. Rooms begins with a famous sentence written 5 years before Yeats' equally famous The Center Cannot Hold, which many have taken as a hint about how to read the work. Act so there is no use in a center. Rooms, and the book, ends with a long paragraph which reads, "A light in the moon, the only light is on Sunday. What was the sensible decision? The sensible decision was that notwithstanding many declarations and more music, not even notwithstanding the choice and a torch and a collection, notwithstanding the celebrating hat and a vacation and even more noise than cutting, notwithstanding Europe and Asia and being overbearing, notwithstanding an elephant and a strict occasion, notwithstanding more cultivation and some seasoning, not even with drowning and with the ocean being encircling, not even with more likeness and any cloud, not even with terrific sacrifice of pedestrianism and a special resolution, not even more likely to be pleasing. The care with which the rain is wrong, and the green is wrong, and the white is wrong, the care with which there is a chair and plenty of breathing, the care with which there is incredible justice and likeness, all this makes a magnificent asparagus, and also a fountain. Rather than launch into an explication of this paragraph, extolling the hermeneutic pleasures of which is one of the main points of this lecture, I'll conclude by restating my thesis in brief with Stein's final words ringing in our ears. I believe Tender Buttons offers us a way of reconciling the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy by engaging with its readers in particular forms of hermeneutic pleasure, a pleasure which is both philosophic and poetic because it involves the fundamental human drive to discover or create meaning, and that it is from such meanings that we derive the values in accordance with which we live. Wittgenstein expressed this truth in section 6.421 of the Tractatus when he observes, ethics and aesthetics are one. Stein says something similar in the newsreel I quoted from earlier. Understanding and enjoyment is the same thing. Stein tells us understanding, the goal of philosophy, and enjoyment, the kind of aesthetic pleasure we gain from our encounters with works of art, is the same thing. By inducting us into the realm of aesthetic pleasure, simultaneously intellectual, insofar as it involves the reader in hermeneutic activity, and sensual, insofar as it involves us in beauty, play, and imagination, Tender Buttons proposes to heal the ancient quarrel and return us as readers to a renewed relationship to reading great works, both of poetry and philosophy. Thank you.